Let me be clear, there will be no unilateral reduction in tariffs against China. The president has made it clear.
Karoline Leavitt's recent live interview was nothing short of a tragedy. It went off the rails almost instantly. She tried to outsmart the media, but instead ended up completely embarrassing herself on a national stage. From what most consider to be inaccurate claims during a White House briefing to desperate attempts to spin the narrative, she practically handed her critics all the ammunition they needed. Today, we're breaking down exactly how it all unraveled and why it's exploding across the headlines. The rise of controversy. In the turbulent landscape of American politics, few figures have emerged as quickly and controversially as Karoline Leavitt. Today, we're examining a situation that has captivated political commentators and everyday Americans alike. White House Press Secretary Karoline Leavitt's recent press appearance that many are describing as nothing short of catastrophic. As the youngest press secretary in American history at just 27 years old, Leavitt has been a lightning rod for both admiration and scrutiny since assuming her role in January 2025. Before we dissect the disaster that unfolded, it's essential to understand the figure at the center of this political storm. Karoline Leavitt rose quickly through Republican ranks, working in the first Trump administration before an unsuccessful congressional run in New Hampshire in 2022. Despite that electoral defeat, her unwavering loyalty to former President Trump secured her a position in his 2024 campaign and ultimately the prestigious role of White House press secretary. Her rapid ascent has been remarkable, from a small-town New Hampshire upbringing to one of the most visible positions in American politics. Leavitt's communication style has been characterized by a combative approach toward traditional media outlets since day one. In her very first briefing on January 28, 2025, she set a confrontational tone, declaring that Americans' trust in mass media has fallen to a record low and emphasizing the inclusion of what she termed new media, podcasters, influencers, and conservative outlets that might be more sympathetic to the administration's messaging. This strategic shift was immediately evident when she called on Axios's Mike Allen and Breitbart's Matt Boyle before legacy outlets like the Associated Press, breaking decades of protocol and signaling a new era in White House communications. The message was clear. The traditional press would no longer be given the deference they'd grown accustomed to over generations. But what exactly happened during the briefing that has everyone talking? Let's examine the pivotal moments that transformed a routine press conference into what critics are calling a complete meltdown. The controversy centers around what has become known as the Signalgate scandal, a significant security breach where top Trump administration officials accidentally included The Atlantic's editor-in-chief Jeffrey Goldberg in a Signal group chat discussing sensitive military strike plans against the Houthis in Yemen. The leaked messages, published by The Atlantic, revealed conversations about potential military operations, creating a firestorm of questions about the administration's information security protocols. On March 26, 2025, Leavitt held what would become an infamous press conference lasting less than 25 minutes. She began by speaking for under 10 minutes before taking questions that quickly centered on the leaked war plans. From the outset, her defensive posture was evident as she dismissed the Atlantic story as sensationalized and accused Goldberg of being an anti-Trump hater and a registered Democrat. What followed was a masterclass in how not to handle a crisis. Leavitt claimed no classified information had been leaked and that National Security Advisor Mike Waltz, who had inadvertently added Goldberg to the chat, had taken responsibility. She mentioned an investigation was underway but provided virtually no specifics, a response that journalists found woefully inadequate given the gravity of the situation. The tension in the room escalated dramatically when CNN's Caitlin Collins attempted to probe deeper, asking if President Trump felt misled by his national security advisors. Leavitt's response was immediate and harsh. Visibly frustrated, she snapped, "I have now been asked and answered this question 3 times by the both of you," refusing to allow a follow-up question and quickly calling on another reporter. This exchange was widely reported as a loss of composure that set the tone for what was to come. As the questioning continued, and it became clear that journalists weren't going to let the Signalgate issue drop, Leavitt made a decision that would define the briefing in public memory. After realizing most questions focused on the scandal, she abruptly ended the conference, citing a need to avoid counter-programming Vice President J.D. Vance's upcoming speech. She also mentioned Trump's scheduled appearances later that day, hastily adding, "Sorry it's a bit shorter today, guys," before making a quick exit from the podium. This premature departure was immediately characterized across social media platforms as her running away from difficult questions. One user on X wrote, "Karoline Leavitt got scared and just ran off the stage after getting grilled by reporters about the Signal chat. Another commented, Karoline Leavitt practically ran out of that press conference after getting hammered by reporters. These sentiments framed her as unprepared and overwhelmed by the scrutiny she faced. The media response was equally unforgiving. Outlets like the Irish Star and the Mirror US described the event as a humiliation, emphasizing Leavitt's apparent inability to handle tough questions. Some forums even used harsh language, with users calling her a rat running away from danger and criticizing her for gaslighting the public about the leaked plans. Perhaps most damaging to Leavitt's credibility was her insistence that the leaked messages were not war plans, but merely attack plans, a distinction that many viewed as meaningless semantic wordplay. Critics, including the Mirror US, pointed out that Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth had posted a timeline of the bombing in the chat, directly contradicting her attempts to downplay the severity of the leak. The fallout continued days later. On April 1, 2025, Leavitt provided what many considered an inadequate update on Signalgate, stating, "This case has been closed here at the White House as far as we are concerned, and that unspecified steps had been taken to prevent future leaks." This vague response only fueled further criticism, with commentators on social media labeling her the resident minister of propaganda for what they perceived as a transparent attempt to sweep a serious national security concern under the rug. The incidents we've explored thus far paint a picture of a press secretary under siege, struggling to maintain control of the narrative amid a major scandal. But the story doesn't end here. In fact, it gets considerably more complicated as Leavitt faced additional controversies in subsequent briefings. How did she handle accusations about spreading misinformation? What happened when she was confronted about controversial immigration policies? And did she manage to recover from her initial stumbles, or did the situation continue to deteriorate? The unraveling. The aftermath of the Signalgate debacle created a challenging environment for Leavitt, with journalists now more determined than ever to hold the administration accountable. Rather than adopting a more measured approach, however, Leavitt doubled down on her combative style, leading to several memorable confrontations that quickly went viral. One particularly notable incident occurred on April 15, 2025, when Leavitt faced questions about the deportation of Kilmar Armando Abrego Garcia, a Salvadoran immigrant with protected legal status. Instead of addressing the legitimate concerns about this case, Leavitt responded with mockery, saying, "Based on the sensationalism of many of the people in this room, you would think we deported a candidate for Father of the Year." This dismissive comment might have been provocative enough on its own, but Leavitt went further, accusing Garcia of human trafficking without providing any evidence to support this serious allegation. This claim immediately drew backlash from advocacy groups and legal experts, with social media users like at Call to Activism describing her statements as a full-blown meltdown of lies. The situation deteriorated further the following day. On April 16, 2025, in what observers described as bizarre behavior, Leavitt initially asked if reporters had questions, but then refused to take any, leading to perceptions that she was tired and defeated. One ex-user, at Lippy Addiction, suggested she was at her breaking point, a sentiment that gained traction as video clips of the awkward moments circulated online. What made these incidents particularly damaging was the growing perception that Leavitt wasn't just struggling under pressure, but actively engaging in deliberate misinformation. Posts on X accused her of using planted stooges in the press room to field softball questions, a claim that gained credibility when the New York Times published an analysis highlighting her reliance on friendly media outlets. Critics described this tactic as authoritarian, with one social media comment stating, "This is how authoritarian states are run." The controversies weren't limited to immigration and media management. Leavitt's handling of economic policy, particularly regarding tariffs, also became a flashpoint. In a Fox News appearance that quickly went viral, she made claims about international trade negotiations that left even the typically friendly Fox hosts visibly confused. In this remarkable exchange, Leavitt attempted to clarify the administration's tariff policy, but instead created more confusion with contradictory statements. The Fox News host directly asked about the timetable for reducing tariffs against China, noting that Trump had been ambiguous about it.
Let me be clear, there will be no unilateral reduction in tariffs against China. The president has made it clear China needs to make a deal with the United States of America, and we are optimistic that will happen.
What made this exchange particularly noteworthy was Leavitt's circular logic, claiming to provide clarity while essentially restating the same ambiguous position that prompted the question in the first place. The Fox host's tepid response, "Okay, well, markets seem to be watching every bit of it," reflected the growing sense that even media outlets typically friendly to the administration were finding it difficult to extract straightforward answers from the press secretary. But perhaps the most eyebrow-raising moment came when Leavitt made an astonishing claim about the number of countries engaged in trade negotiations with the United States.
Too long. And President Trump has brought hundreds of countries now from around the world to the negotiating table. We have 18 proposals on paper from nations around the world who recognize that they have, in fact, been ripping off the United States.
This statement was immediately flagged by fact checkers as mathematically impossible, given that there are only 195 countries in the world recognized by the United Nations, 193 member states plus 2 non-member observer states. Even accounting for territories or autonomous regions, the claim of hundreds of countries engaging in negotiations was simply not credible. The accuracy issues extended to other policy areas as well. When questioned about immigration statistics during a briefing, Leavitt provided figures that seemed to lack any firm basis in official data.
Well, you'd have to ask the Department of Homeland Security for a specific number, but we suspect it's definitely in the millions, perhaps upwards of 20 million people that were allowed into the country illegally by the previous administration. And the president and his team are focused on deporting as many as we possibly can, and they are moving as quickly as possible.
When pressed to provide specific numbers on how many undocumented immigrants were in the country, Leavitt first deflected by saying, "You'd have to ask the Department of Homeland Security," but then immediately offered a speculative figure of perhaps upwards of 20 million people, a number significantly higher than most credible estimates. This pattern of deflection, followed by unsubstantiated claims, became a hallmark of her briefing style, leaving journalists and viewers alike questioning the reliability of the information being presented. The cumulative effect of these missteps was a growing crisis of credibility. Even conservative media outlets, which had initially celebrated Leavitt's appointment as a breath of fresh air, began to express concerns about her handling of basic facts. Her youth, once touted as an advantage that brought energy and fresh perspective to the role, was increasingly cited as a liability, with critics questioning whether she had the experience necessary to navigate the complexities of White House communications. Adding to the pressure was Leavitt's implementation of controversial changes to press room protocols. In a move that drew sharp criticism from media organizations, she announced that the White House would take control of the briefing room seating chart, stripping the White House Correspondents Association of its traditional role in this process. This decision, which appeared designed to favor pro-Trump and digital-first outlets over legacy media like CNN and NBC, was characterized by critics as a calculated effort to humiliate and sideline traditional journalism. Leavitt defended the change by stating, "It's not about ideology, it's about increasing the wide array of outlets that have access." But many viewed this explanation with skepticism, especially given her previous comments disparaging legacy media. The controversy intensified when it was reported that certain outlets, including the Associated Press, had been barred from the press pool for reportedly ignoring Trump's executive order renaming the Gulf of Mexico to the Gulf of America. These structural changes, combined with her confrontational rhetoric and factual inconsistencies, created what many observers described as a perfect storm. Rather than fulfilling the traditional role of the press secretary to serve as a bridge between the administration and the public through the media, Leavitt seemed to be constructing walls, limiting access to those deemed friendly while alienating outlets with larger audiences and established journalistic credentials. The situation reached a new level of absurdity on April 17, 2025, when Chinese envoy Zhang Zhisheng pointed out on social media that the red dress with lace that Leavitt wore during a press briefing was made in China, a deeply ironic twist given the administration's tough rhetoric on Chinese imports and tariffs. Weibo posts from Chinese textile workers claiming to have produced the dress in Mabu, China, went viral, with Zhang stating, "Accusing China is business, buying China is life." This fashion faux pas, while seemingly trivial compared to policy matters, became emblematic for critics of what they perceived as the administration's hypocritical stance on trade. As these controversies accumulated, the pressure on Leavitt intensified. Her responses became increasingly defensive, and her body language during briefings suggested growing discomfort. The young press secretary, who had once been lauded for her confidence and poise, now appeared at times to be struggling to maintain her composure in the face of relentless questioning. Yet the worst was still to come. Soon, a series of dramatic incidents pushed the situation from bad to catastrophic, culminating in what many political observers now describe as one of the most disastrous periods for White House communications in recent memory. The question was no longer whether Leavitt could recover her footing, but rather how much more damage would be done before a change of course became inevitable. The aftermath. The combination of the Signalgate debacle, her confrontational media strategy, and the growing list of factual inaccuracies had created a perfect storm of credibility issues. But rather than a course correction, what followed was a series of incidents that further undermined her standing and transformed what might have been salvageable missteps into what many now view as an unmitigated disaster. On April 19, 2025, in what should have been a routine ceremony, Leavitt abruptly ended a briefing due to a medical emergency during Dr. Mehmet Oz's swearing in as administrator for the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services. Witnesses described her shouting "press out" to evacuate reporters, a moment characterized as panicked by media outlets. While this response may have been appropriate given the circumstances, the optics of yet another prematurely terminated briefing reinforced the narrative of a press secretary struggling to maintain control. The following week brought no respite. On April 22, 2025, Leavitt found herself defending Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth amid reports of dismissed Pentagon officials leaking against him. When asked directly if President Trump still had confidence in Hegseth despite the controversies, she responded with unequivocal support.
No travel plans at this time. Doesn't mean it's not happening. I just don't have anything to share. But the president, of course, is aware of the passing of the Pope and did put out a statement this morning. And we're praying for the millions of Christians around the world who loved the Pope and admired him this morning. The president absolutely has confidence in Secretary Hegseth. I spoke to him about it this morning, and he stands strongly behind him.
This expression of support was followed by more detailed comments when a reporter pressed her on her claim that the entire Pentagon is working against Secretary Hegseth, despite the fact that the fired officials were Hegseth's own appointees.
They were Pentagon employees who leaked against their boss to news agencies in this room, and it's been clear since day one from this administration that we are not going to tolerate individuals who leak to the mainstream media, particularly when it comes to sensitive information. And the Secretary of Defense is doing a tremendous job, and he is bringing monumental change to the Pentagon.
Her characterization of the fired officials as disloyal leakers contradicted reports that they were part of Hegseth's inner circle, raising questions about her grasp of the situation or willingness to present an accurate picture. More troubling was her blanket dismissal of leaks to the mainstream media as inherently problematic, regardless of the substance or public interest in the information being revealed. This stance on leaks appeared particularly hypocritical given the administration's own challenges with information security, as exemplified by the Signalgate scandal. Leavitt's attempt to frame media reporting based on such leaks as a smear campaign further strained her relationship with journalists who viewed their work as essential accountability reporting. The controversy over Leavitt's handling of press briefings extended beyond specific policy issues to encompass broader concerns about the administration's media strategy. A New York Times analysis claimed she relied on planted stooges in the press room to field softball questions, enabling her to push administration talking points with minimal scrutiny. While this characterization may have been overblown, there were legitimate questions about the systematic favoring of sympathetic outlets and the marginalization of those perceived as critical. Leavitt's personal style also became a subject of discussion. Her practice of praying with staff before briefings, reported by the Washington Post, sparked controversy when social media users characterized it as a vile PR stunt, a criticism that supporters viewed as an unfair attack on her sincere religious expression. This incident highlighted how even aspects of Leavitt's personal approach to the job had become politicized in the intensely partisan environment of Washington. The cumulative effect of these controversies was a press secretary increasingly viewed through polarized lenses. Supporters, particularly on conservative platforms like Fox News and accounts like @Vigilant Fox on X, praised her for shattering media narratives and standing firm against what they perceived as hostile questioning. Critics, meanwhile, saw a propagandist who prioritized loyalty to Trump over factual accuracy and transparent communication with the American public. This division was evident in the contrasting ways her performance was characterized. To her supporters, Leavitt was a bold defender of Trump's agenda who refused to be intimidated by a biased press corps. To her critics, she was unprofessional, evasive, and increasingly overwhelmed by the demands of a job for which she lacked the necessary experience. The reality, as is often the case, was more nuanced than either of these extreme characterizations. Leavitt's youth and relative inexperience were undoubtedly factors in her struggles, but many of the issues stemmed from deliberate strategic strategic choices rather than simple mistakes. The decision to prioritize new media over traditional outlets, the confrontational approach to questioning, and the willingness to make statements without solid factual grounding all reflected a specific vision of how the White House should engage with the press, one that prioritized message discipline and base mobilization over broad public information. This approach had historical precedents in previous administrations, particularly during Trump's first term, when press secretaries like Sean Spicer and Kayleigh McEnany often adopted similarly combative stances toward the media. What distinguished Leavitt's tenure, however, was the intensity and frequency of the confrontations, as well as the backdrop of specific controversies like Signalgate that demanded more nuanced handling. The aftermath of these tumultuous weeks was predictable, a significant erosion of Leavitt's credibility with large segments of the media and public. Even outlets that had initially been supportive began to express reservations about her approach, concerned that the constant controversies were overshadowing the administration's policy agenda. The question of whether she could effectively serve as the public face of the White House became a topic of open speculation. Particularly damaging was the perception that Leavitt was not merely struggling, but actively misleading the public. Her unsubstantiated claim about hundreds of countries engaging in trade negotiations, her unsupported accusation that Kilmar Armando Abrego Garcia was involved in human trafficking, and her insistence that the Signalgate messages did not constitute war plans, all contributed to a growing sense that factual accuracy was not a priority in her communications strategy. This approach had real-world consequences beyond the political sphere. Markets reacted to her confusing statements on tariff policies, with investors struggling to discern the administration's actual intentions. International allies and adversaries alike found it difficult to interpret the administration's positions when they were presented in such contradictory terms, and ordinary Americans seeking clear information about government policies were left with more questions than answers after many of her briefings. It's worth noting that Leavitt's struggles occurred against a backdrop of significant policy challenges. The administration was grappling with complex issues related to immigration, trade, national security, and economic policy, all areas where clear, consistent communication was essential. The controversy surrounding her briefing style and factual accuracy made it more difficult to effectively convey the administration's approach to these crucial matters. Some critics have argued that Leavitt's difficulties were symptomatic of broader issues within the administration: a preference for loyalty over expertise, a reflexive hostility toward traditional media, and a willingness to sacrifice factual precision for political advantage. Others have suggested that she was hampered by impossible expectations, tasked with defending controversial policies in a media environment that was predominantly skeptical, if not openly hostile. What's clear is that the series of press briefings we've examined represented a significant failure of political communication, regardless of one's ideological perspective. Even viewed in the most charitable light, these events did not achieve their presumed objective of effectively conveying the administration's positions and priorities to the American public. Instead, they became the story themselves, distracting from, rather than highlighting the work of the government. What is beyond dispute is that these press briefings marked a significant moment in the evolving relationship between the White House and the media, a relationship that remains essential to the functioning of American democracy, regardless of the administration in power or the individuals who represent it to the public. If you enjoyed this video and want to see more like it, be sure to check out the cards popping up on your screen.